Welcome to Las Vegas Business Bankruptcy and Construction Law Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Las Vegas Business Bankruptcy and Construction Law Podcast with Micheal Brock of Maybrock Law Group. Micheal's a business and bankruptcy attorney who works with companies across Nevada facing financial pressure, debt issues, and complex disputes. With a background in both law and business, he helps clients understand their options and make practical decisions when things get difficult. My name is Sean O'Connor, and today, Micheal and I are talking about what happens when a business can't pay its debts anymore. Well, lots happens, right, Micheal? Good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Sean. Thank you.
This happens, right? A business starts to fall behind on its obligations. What are some of the early signs, that things are moving from a temporary short-term issue, cash flow pressure happens into something, more dire?
So some key early warning signs might include, persistently or frequently defaulting on payments. We're not talking about just delays, but like actual defaults on payments. That can often trigger some default provisions in certain agreements. You might also see where a business owner starts paying one creditor and not another, the classic robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. Yeah. That tends to indicate that there's some insufficient overall liquidity within the company and that there's been some kind of loss over cash management. Something else that we'll often see is that there's an increased reliance on short-term fixes, such as using credit cards or cash advances or high interest loans. That often will suggest that there's some capital structure in the business that's unsustainable.
Okay, that makes sense. So, you're in this kind of a circumstance, the pressure starts building. How do these, creditors or vendors that you've defaulted on, other lenders, what's their typical response? What have you seen?
Well, what we see is that, as pressure starts building, these creditors typically shift from an initial attitude of being willing to work with the business owner to one where they're saying, let's protect ourselves and let's get paid before anybody else. So at first, they'll just observe, trying to determine if this is just a temporary situation the business is going through, or if it's the beginning of a default. And then as things progress and the situation deteriorates, they'll start tightening up their credit terms to reduce their own exposure. And then eventually, if there's an indication that there's not going to be any kind of a turnaround or an improvement, they'll start to take increased efforts to collect what's owed to them, including taking legal action.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, we may get into this later in terms of the whole, the importance of a good relationship. As you start, as a business on the business side, right? Owners, how do they? What have you seen in terms of how they try to manage that situation early? Like, what strategies do you see them attempting?
Usually, at an early stage, we see owners they're trying to buy time, asking for extended credit terms. Maybe they try and set up some sort of a payment plan or request some sort of a temporary deferral. They might also, like I said before, they might also make decisions about trying to decide who are critical vendors that need to be paid, kind of the paying one creditor over another, so that they can basically they're trying to buy themselves some time to see if they can improve the situation, get themselves out of the fix that they're in and get on the right track again.
Yeah, like that visual of treading water, trying to stay above it. Where do you see these efforts break down? I'm sure there's it stopped working. Yeah, it always does, that kind of a thing. What have you seen?
Yeah, generally those efforts start to break down when, this may sound surprising, but when the owners stop being transparent with their creditors. Sometimes it breaks down too because the owners in their efforts to try and preserve things, they dig themselves actually into a deeper hole by incurring new debt with no realistic ability to repay. So it's important that owners recognize there is a problem early and then they try and act swiftly to address it, because a delayed response can lead to failure.
Yeah, it's how the things snowball. I mean, even on the consumer side, I think we've maybe all been there to a certain degree where it's like, oh shoot, lost my job or didn't, and credit card this and like, oh, whoops, it's so much easy to get into debt, so hard to get out.
Right.
What does I think just the human stress, there's the business stress, there's just the personal stress, especially if you're an owner operator. How does that kind of financial pressure start to affect day-to-day operations as the cycle plays out?
It can do that in some very visible ways, progressing from maybe a cash issue to an execution problem, and then we'll see some sort of a control problem with the business. So as pressure starts to build, day-to-day operations shift from planned activities to becoming much more reactive. And then that, if things don't improve, eventually that can lead to real chaos. Business owners can be working under a lot of stress. They're often dealing with incomplete information, and that can lead to a feeling of a need to take some kind of urgent action. And because of that pressure, they may be disregarding their better judgment, taking on bad deals just to try and survive and keep the business going. That breakdown can also lead to breaches of contract, maybe their employment issues, such as wage claims with their employees, maybe violations of some of the regulations that govern the business.
Yeah.
And so the operational stress can become more than just stress. It can become legal exposure.
Yeah. I mean, they're like payroll issues and tax, all that stuff. Those obligations that are pretty well regulated. So, we've kind of painted this picture. The pressure's building. The owner scrambling, making reactive, emotional decisions. At what juncture does the situation shift, right, from something that kind of informal? I think we've got some potential problems here to where, holy cow, we do need a legal solution.
I'd say there's not really any single bright line, but from a legal perspective, the shift often happens when the situation moves from one where the owner can say, we can manage this through relationships, to
Right.
where legal rights and remedies are now driving the outcomes. So in practical terms, that transition will show up through a combination of triggers such as formal defaults or creditors taking legal action against the business. And then there's a loss of flexibility, and that also leads to sometimes a loss of access to credit, and then there's a liquidity crisis. So a structured legal solution for a business might include such things as extrajudicial restructuring, or maybe some asset sales or forbearance agreements with some of your creditors, or even possibly a receivership or a bankruptcy filing.
And are there key factors, when you're looking at whether a business is, still a viable, ongoing kind of concern versus when, the writing's on the wall, we need to, consider, as you led up to their bankruptcy, which seems like, the most extreme solution. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but how do you make that call?
That's really a core judgment call when you're in a distress situation. It's less about a single metric, as I kind of mentioned before, and it's more about whether the business still has a realistic path to sustainable operations versus whether they're just delaying eventual failure. So we want to look at whether the business is fundamentally profitable. Can it produce consistent cash flow? Is there a market for the demand for the products or services that they're offering? A business is still viable if it can generate sustainable value and there's a credible path to stabilize it. But if time is running out and coordination with creditors is breaking down, or the underlying business really no longer works, then maybe it's time to consider bankruptcy.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like it's almost like a very purposeful, almost audit, taking stock of, what business are we in? Is everything fundamentally sound? And there was some factors that were one-time events that got out of control, or it's like, what, our competition has us beat, or the market's dried up, or whatever. That's
Right, right.
I mean, but also I'm thinking like that kind of. I mean, you never have all the information you need. There's always some crystal balling in there, and you're under pressure. Count the time, right? How does timing come into play? There are certain things like if you're going to do it, you got to do it now because of this or that, or you know what I'm saying? Like where are there internal or external factors on the timing of what's the best time or worst time to do that kind of a thing?
Sure. I mean, timing is often a deciding factor. Really, to kind of put it very frankly, early action preserves options. Late actions force outcomes. So the optimal decision point is usually
Hold on,
earlier
hold on,
on.
hold on. Say that again. I think that should be a headline. Early options, no, early actions preserve options. Late actions force outcomes.
That's right. Yeah.
That's great.
So yeah, if you delay, then you're put in a situation where other people are going to be making the decisions, and you're just going to be facing the outcomes of those decisions. But if you act early, then you have more control over the situation. There are more options, more choices that are available to you.
Hmm.
And so, that's how you are able to preserve those options. So early action, again, is what we always recommend to our clients rather than.
Yeah, yeah. Again, somewhat proactive approach. So can you get into some of that a little bit with, just with the time we have left? I'd love to hear about the way in which like what are these options? How do they constrict? And if you end up in a bond, like what gets forced upon you versus what you could have handled more on more favorable terms, on your own terms.
Yeah. Um, so it's not just that things necessarily get worse if you wait, but it's that the nature of your options shift from, as we were talking about, being more proactive and having flexible solutions to becoming more reactive and having constrained outcomes. So you're no longer able to choose the best path, you're just choosing what's left.
Hmm.
Waiting too long doesn't just reduce the number of options that are available to you, but it also changes the quality of those options. So
Yeah.
the longer you wait, the more outcomes become driven by, as I said before, someone else.
Yeah.
But if
The
you act
judge.
early, you're solving a business problem. Whereas if you're acting late, then you're often managing a legal and a creditor problem.
Do you have any? I'm just curious because I know you're out there in the world. You're dealing with all sorts of businesses and helping them navigate these kinds of rough waters, so to speak. Is there an example here before we say goodbye? Is there? I know you can't name names, but is there something in a recent situation where it's like, oh, my client acted in a timely fashion, was able to do X, and had they not, then it would have been Y.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had a client who had a business. They were having some issues with cash flow, but they recognized that there was a problem. So there was a delay. They had cash. They knew that money was going to be coming in, but there was a delay on it. But it was affecting their business operations. They decided to take action early, met with them, looked at what their options were. We decided that under the circumstances, a Chapter 11 filing was probably going to be good for them because they were carrying a fair amount of debt as well. That gave us an opportunity to sort of restructure that debt. And we could show that this was a viable business. There was cash flow. It was just because of the way the business was structured and the contracts that they had that some of that cash flow was going to be delayed. So the bankruptcy filing made sense for them. They were able to get through the bankruptcy, restructure some of their debt, and continue on operating, as a viable, successful business.
Oh wow, that's a great example where they just like, as you said, their business structure, but essentially like, I'm waiting on payments. I got accounts receivables that are absolutely substantial,
Yeah,
but without but without that money in, I can't buy my raw materials or pay my people or whatever it is, given the business they're in, huh?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example. Well, Michael, thank you. Thanks for uh, sharing your expertise. Anything we might have just left out? I know we'll talk again in the future, but anything you want to leave people with before we sign off?
No, nothing specific, Sean. I just really appreciate you having me today. It was great talking to you.
Absolutely. And when I look forward to our next conversation. That's it for today's episode of the Las Vegas Business Bankruptcy and Construction Law Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Michael Brock and how he helps Nevada business owners navigate financial pressure, debt, and bankruptcy decisions, visit the website maybrocklaw.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Sean O'Connor. And do us a favor, subscribe, share a link, or leave a review so more business owners can find the guidance they need. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.